Welcome, everyone. My name is Lanier Anderson. I'm the chair of the Philosophy Department at Stanford, and it is an honor and my enormous pleasure to introduce the 2024 Kant Lecturer, Professor Peter Godfrey-Smith, who currently teaches in the History and Philosophy of Science unit at the University of Sydney and is a fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales. The Kant Lectures are a 3-event series. There will be a first lecture tonight in this space, a second lecture tomorrow night, also in this same space, and then on Friday in the afternoon at 3:30, I think it's 3:30, there will be a 2-hour discussion for extended probing of the ideas in the lectures, which will take place in the terrace room in the English department, building 460. Peter Godfrey-Smith is no stranger to Stanford philosophy. We were his home in his first academic job from 1991 to 2003, where he was part of the Stanford School in the Philosophy of Science. Our departmental life was decisively shaped by Peter's intellectual energy, by his philosophical creativity, his wide-ranging interests and connections, and his uncontainable spirit of fun. The Kant Lectures are the centerpiece of the department's intellectual life. They're made possible by the Elisabeth Rankin Crossett Fund. Under the name of the greatest philosopher who ever lived, each year we invite one of the most important philosophers now working to offer a detailed look into a large project at the center of their concerns. The lectures can treat any topic within philosophy, which is to say any topic worth talking about whatsoever. Through their history since the mid-1970s, the Kant Lectures have explored the work of a wide variety of thinkers, from John Rawls, Judith Jarvis Thomson, and Alan Gibbard, through W.V. Quine, Donald Davidson, and David Lewis. Some lecturers, like Hilary Putnam or Peter Railton or Michael Friedman, chose to connect the lectures to Kantian themes in their own work. Others, like Elizabeth Anscombe or Sally Haslanger or Jerry Fodor or Peter's advisor Philip Kitcher, not so much. This year's lectures travel under the title Mind Around Us, and while the topic of the mind's place in nature is Kantian in the broadest sense, my expectation is that this year's lecture will not depart from especially Kantian starting points, but Peter can tell us about that. Godfrey-Smith is one of the leading philosophers working today, and the mind's place in nature has been among his most abiding concerns. It was the subject of his first book, Complexity and the Function of the Mind in Nature from 1996, which defended an environmental complexity thesis, holding that the function of cognitive representation was to enable the organism to cope effectively with environmental complexity and variability. That early book also forecasted the distinctive range of expertise that has continued to characterize Peter's contributions. He is a sophisticated philosopher of biology, fully living up to the Stanford School tradition of close and detailed engagement with the underlying science, but he is just as deeply grounded in central semantic traditions, the theory of information, signaling theory, the nature of representation, and in core topics in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind, causation, reduction, functionalism, etc. Godfrey-Smith went on to become, just my opinion, but I have the floor, so I get to say, the dominant voice in the philosophy of biology worldwide. Already in his early work, he was celebrated for field-shaping interventions in debates over the function concept, adaptationism, and levels of selection, but an even more decisive contribution was to come in his Lakatos Prize-winning 2009 book, Darwinian Populations and Natural Selection. The theory of evolution by natural selection is, of course, the basic framing theory for the biological sciences overall, and Godfrey-Smith provides it in that book with an illuminating new basic conceptual framework. The core innovation is the concept of the Darwinian population, understood as any group of interacting things with the key features necessary to exhibit evolution by natural selection. Some kind of replication, together with heritability in that process, variation across the population, and differential reproductive success in relation to some environment. The book highlights the striking fact that Darwinian populations are possible at a wide variety of organizational levels. For example, the genes in a chromosome, the chromosomes in a cell, the cells in a multicellular organism, such organisms within some community, or even groups of such organisms. It thereby develops a framework of striking explanatory power that yields progress on long-standing problems of evolutionary theory, like group selection, cultural evolution, and much more. Darwinian populations turn out to be, as Peter very aptly put it in the preface to that book, extraordinary arrangements of ordinary things. Since the Darwinian Populations book, Godfrey-Smith has continued to produce technical contributions at a remarkable clip across the full range of his expertise, with exciting new papers about evolutionary theory, signaling, representation, philosophy of mind, the history of pragmatism, and more. By now, he's published well more than 100 papers, now including a new sideline of empirical work on cephalopods, octopuses, cuttlefish, etc., that grew out of his careful, curious-minded observations while pursuing his passionate hobby, now I guess no longer merely a hobby, of diving. His observations of cephalopod behavior led to a striking line of thought about the radically different mode of cognition manifest in these remarkable animals, and that ultimately opened up a whole new chapter in Godfrey-Smith's body of work. I refer to his more recent bravura performance in public philosophy, represented by the trilogy of books Other Minds from Farrar Straus in 2016, winner of the Patrick Suppice Prize from the American Philosophical Society, Metazoa Farrar Straus in 2020, and the just newly published Living on Earth from Macmillan, just out this fall. These books represent public philosophy at its very best. They're beautifully written, accessible to a broad audience, and tied back to personal experiences that pull the reader in to a narrative. Like the best science writing, Peter is able to bring technical scientific results to a wide audience in ways that are relatively comprehensible, readily comprehensible, but nevertheless produce deep understanding in the reader. But by contrast to the general run of science writing, Godfrey-Smith's purpose is not just to explain the science, but to raise, explore, and then address and answer some of the very deepest philosophical questions through his engagement with our empirical knowledge of the world. In these books, the philosophy, too, is accessible to a broad, educated public, but without the least loss in precision of thought, depth of conception, or analytical penetration. The core ambition of the Trilogy Project is continuous with Godfrey-Smith's long-standing philosophical preoccupation to understand the place of the mind in nature. As he points out in Other Minds, the encounter with cephalopods, highly intelligent, behaviorally complex creatures operating in a completely different environment and emerging from a totally different branch of the tree of life from ours, is about as close as we'll ever come, at least in our lifetimes, to an encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence, and the contrast promises a unique class of insights. That is, the radically different phylogeny and ecosystem of the cephalopods shows how a completely different kind of mind grapples with the same world we share. And the contrast reveals both what is distinctive about the particular modes of cognition and what cognition itself must be like. Godfrey-Smith extends that work in Metazoa, taking the mind-body problem biological, as he puts it, by exploring why mindedness emerges in biological organisms and how those organisms have been shaped by the physical world we inhabit. In the new book, Living on Earth, he turns to an alternative perspective on the history of life, focused on how organisms have shaped the environment in their turn. As he perceptively notes, an organism is a kind of nexus where perception meets action and the past meets the future. The history of the effects of organisms' actions on their world, how they have reshaped the environment for themselves and for other organisms, is just as much a part of the biological history of mindedness as the stories of mind's emergence that he explored in Other Minds and Metazoa. This long arc of work has been in the service of a disciplined, determined effort to make biological sense of the fact of consciousness, of cognitive mind, and how it has emerged in nature and the roles that it plays there. This is, of course, one version of the fundamental philosophical project of identifying and explaining our basic place in the universe. Peter's project and the current set of lectures on Mind Around Us will advance that agenda. Before I close, please just permit me one personal note. Peter was actually on leave the year I arrived at Stanford, but I felt his presence already in the very first week. He sent his best advisee to me. He told the DUS she had to be assigned to me, and he sent her prepared with a set of questions for me, a set of questions that I was at pains to answer. Peter was also being considered for promotion to tenure that year, and back in those days, the process was completed on paper. So all of Peter's work was laid out in a special room in the back so that the members of the department could familiarize themselves with it in preparation for considering the case. I arrived as a visiting assistant professor, and it was totally intimidating to go into that room and see that work. The way I remember it, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a book and 16 papers and 12 reviews, and all the papers were pretty much non-overlapping with the book, and that was my first introduction to what was going to be required for tenure at Stanford, and it was super intimidating. Once Peter got back to campus, I found that he also had a definite set of questions for me. They turned out to be about how to understand Hegel and how to explain his influence on Dewey. In those conversations, I was not able to do as good a job as I should have done in answering, but they opened a conversation from which I have not ceased to benefit to this very day. Every single time I talk to Peter, I learn something new. Every time I come to admire him more. It has been one of the incredible, lucky hit blessings of my whole life to count you as a friend. And it was one of the main setbacks of my Stanford life when Peter departed here to ply his talents elsewhere. It's therefore a special joy to welcome back Peter Godfrey-Smith as this year's Kant Lecturer. With that, I give you my friend and colleague, Professor Peter Godfrey-Smith.
Thank you so much, Lanier. I appreciate that more than I can express. Okay, it's wonderful to be back at Stanford as well. This pair of lectures will be more like one long lecture in two parts within naturalistic philosophy of mind and biologically oriented cognitive science. The topic is basic or simple minds, the most basic, and hence how much of it there is around us. I want to explore what the most marginal and not quite cases look like, the ground floor, the basement, and the sub-basement. The project is exploratory, and I don't think it makes sense to try to be too definite here, especially because I think the framework that we're using on the mental side can be expected to change. Our sense of what has to be explained will change as we get fragments of the explanation. But I will try to give an account that has a fairly definite shape. This won't be a these animals can do that and these ones can't sort of lecture, except for a bit at the beginning and the end. It'll be more an attempt to get into principles. I do like to make connections to the namesakes in lectures like this. Is there a connection to Kant? I won't try to make much of one here, although there are points of contact. Mental unity, teleology, and spontaneity in particular. There are a lot of connections to Stanford, to philosophers like Fred Dretske, Rosa Kow now, And I see myself as making use of the Stanford tradition in naturalistic philosophy. Also, its tradition of not being too concerned about philosophy's borders, as seen in people like Suppies, Hacking, Perry, Wassow, and many others. Here is how the lectures will go. There'll be a bit of evolutionary framing, an outline of some parts of the history of life that will be relevant, looking especially at behaviour. Then I'll outline what I will call two models or families of mind-related processes with distinct but connected histories that point differently in relation to precursors and marginal cases. Then there'll be a long resolution of that apparent choice between models along a, we want some of both line. By the middle of the second lecture, we're looking explicitly at sentience and experience, that whole side of the mind, especially at how the combined resources of the two models help us with that side of a topic. There won't be a lot about AI and other artificial systems, a topic of intense interest around here, although the ideas do bear on those issues and they will come up from time to time. Okay, as I say, it's sort of one long lecture in two parts. I think I know where the break will be. I won't give much of a summary at the end of the first lecture, but I will reintroduce the main ideas at the start of lecture 2 to make sure the lectures each make sense on their own. Okay, the evolutionary context. Life on Earth began sometime over 3 billion years ago. I have an example on the slide of a view of the origins of life, a deep sea vent-based account. I take life to be a combination of metabolic and reproduction-related capacities. Living systems use sources of energy and other resources to maintain their otherwise improbable organization through networks of chemical reactions. That's the metabolic side. And living systems also tend to reproduce and form populations that evolve. Now, those two capacities are separable, as seen in viruses, having the latter but not the former, but they're also tied together a lot. Reproduction generally requires the metabolic control of energy by someone. Viruses have to use the metabolic capacities of cells. Now, I said a moment ago at the start that I think the framework we're using on the mental side can be expected to change, and our sense of what has to be explained will change as we get fragments of the explanation. The case of life provides a model here. Life, I think, has been pretty well explained, and explained in a particular partly or mildly deflationary way. A cluster, or rather two clumps of properties, has replaced the sort of capital L life with which we started. As life has become better understood in terms of metabolism, reproduction, and evolution, life itself has become less of a weight-bearing property in its own right. So asking about life on other planets is still sensible. As a preliminary, we'd quickly, I think, move to a finer-grained framework if we found some candidates asking about metabolism and reproductive lineages. And I think something a bit like this is likely in the case of the mind also. The mild deflation that we've seen with the concept of life provides an analogy. Okay, life comes to exist, leading to something like bacteria at a relatively early stage. A feature that will become relevant later is the thermodynamic inevitability of selves of a simple kind. Living things use energy to create and maintain order, and they need and eventually impose boundedness, or at least a strong bias in interactions, lest that order diffuse away. So you get membranes, borders with controlled traffic across them. Some later events: the origin of oxygen-producing photosynthesis freed life from a kind of marginal role on Earth. Later, we see eukaryotes, larger and more complicated cells, formed in part by some simpler cells swallowing others. The internal cytoskeleton was elaborated in eukaryotes, enabling action through controlled changes of shape. The world of single-celled eukaryotes before animals was probably a world of active forms, a world of predation, a world read in micro-teeth and nanoclaw. Then, though, we get the origin of animals. A size advantage in that context of protist eukaryotic single-celled ecology may have been part of this. Some eukaryotes readily form colonies, and one branch initiated animals. The fossil record suggests seafloor and stationary forms early on, though there is a possible bias here that's always bothered me. Early jellyfish-like forms in the water column would be especially hard to preserve. A major part of animal evolution that ensued was reinventing action on the larger spatial scale of multicellular organisms. There are a few mobile animals that act as wholes without a nervous system, but nervous systems are all over, and a large part of what made it possible to reinvent action at the larger spatial scale of beings like us. Now, the animal part of the story can be organized and summarized with a picture like this. So in this picture, time is going up the screen with successive branchings between groups. Nervous systems arose very early, way back, before the split between animals like jellyfish, who are sort of radially symmetrical, and bilaterally symmetrical animals like us. The orange region where many of those early splits occurred is now called the Ediacaran, a quiet time, but showing signs of the beginnings of motion and that left-right symmetrical design. Then we reach the Cambrian, the green band in the diagram, a higher oxygen regime, and a time during which a coevolutionary process produced a lot more complexity in animal behavior. Three groups who had diverged before this in the Ediacaran came to develop conspicuous behavioral complexity. Those I have in red: arthropods, the group that includes insects and spiders and crustaceans; vertebrates, our group; and cephalopods as a special group within the mollusks. These all have very different brain architectures. Now, that's the early and relevant part of the animal story. Plants evolved from colonies of green algae on land from something like 470 million years ago. Fungi have an obscure single-celled aquatic origin and then came onto life, became more recognizable around the same time as plants. Now, in the animal case, as I said, complex cognition and behavior arose several times, and at least in many respects independently from a flatworm-like common ancestor. Now, when I use the word cognition, sorry, I meant to have that slide in there just to sort of illustrate the three groups in which conspicuous behavioral complexity is seen: arthropods, vertebrates, and the cephalopods. Cognition. There's a standard sort of summary by Sarah Shuttleworth of what cognition is in a biological setting, which I'm basically okay with. So I'm going to gesture towards this when necessary as a summary of what I mean by cognition. Now, there is a reification of the idea of information there that might be questioned, but I'm basically going to go along with this in these lectures. Now, in those three groups that evolved independently from before the Cambrian, we see a number of important parallel innovations, including in all three: image-forming eyes, high-resolution image-forming eyes; navigation and manipulation in some species; learning. Here there are many forms to think about, and there's probably in learning a mixture of once invented and conserved forms of learning, which are simpler from the common ancestor of bilaterally symmetrical animals or before, and convergent or parallel evolution of other kinds. Some clearly parallel or convergent cases include social learning, which you can't do without decent eyes, seen in bees and in us; Classical conditioning or Pavlovian learning to predict based on associations, may well be all over the place. Learning by reinforcement, trial and error, has an unclear history, especially because it fades off into various minimal forms. Sleep is very old, perhaps conserved from early in animal evolution, and more relevantly, two phases of sleep, a distinction between active sleep and quiet sleep, is seen in all three, in some arthropods, in octopuses, and invertebrates. Now, the way it works in octopuses raises questions of dreaming. There's some evidence that active sleep in octopuses is dream associated in the same way that it is with us. Here we reach our first encounter with questions about consciousness or subjective experience in a basic sense. Now, the minimal sense or the basic sense I have in mind in these lectures, I'm going to work pretty much with the broad sense of the word consciousness that's common now in philosophy and neuroscience, which follows the Thomas Nagel formula. You're conscious if there's something it's like to be you, something it feels like to be you. This is a broadening from earlier senses of the word. And I had three groups on my chart with conspicuous behavioral complexity. I think there's good evidence that members of all three of those groups are conscious. Now, dreaming is a hard case to study, but there is now decent evidence for pain-like states in all three of the groups, where in the two problematic ones, arthropods and cephalopods, the argument goes from an integrated and multifaceted response to aversive stimuli, showing trade-offs, a role for analgesic drugs, and other phenomena. And there are no cases with this sort of moderate degree of clarity as far as evidence for pain goes outside of those three groups. And in a minimal sense, pain is a form of conscious or felt experience. Now, we could spend a lot of time on these different kinds of animals, but this is mainly background for these lectures. I want to go further back, look outside these groups, think about the first hints, the transition from no mind to mind, from no to yes, with respect to felt experience or consciousness, but also with respect to other features. So within animals, we have the three conspicuous groups, and we can also look out along the top of the animal tree at less conspicuous cases. Animals who are slower, with bodies that do less, with simpler lives and simpler nervous systems, earthworms, tiny crustaceans, anemones, and the like. And we can also look down into history. Now, when we do that looking down, there's a motivation for some sort of gradualism in our view. Whatever minds are, especially experiencing minds, they are complicated and probably evolved gradually from all sorts of halfway and quarter-way cases. Now, that's a historical hypothesis, but one that also affects how we see the other groups along the top of the tree, animals with simpler nervous systems and also non-animals. It means, it suggests, though it doesn't imply, that partway and liminal cases are likely now too. It suggests we should get used to the idea of graded presence of the mind as well as gradual change. Now, in this context, the cognitive and the more experiential sides of the mind have looked very different to people, at least to philosophers. A gradualist picture seems to pose little or no problem on the cognitive side, sensing and perception, memory and learning, and so on. Now, some people might not agree because perhaps of the special status of representation, but there's a lot more pressure on the sentience side. Not so much about gradual change, but concerning what we can call graded presence, the coherence of a partway state, a not clearly yes, not clearly no state. Nagel had in his famous formula, you're conscious if there's something it's like to be you. Well, something versus nothing, that looks like a sharp distinction. How can there be sort of something, sort of nothing it's like to be you? Now, this is part of what motivates my expectation that our concepts, the framing that's been used in all these debates will change over the coming years. The second lecture is when I will consider sentience or consciousness explicitly, and that's when the gradualism questions will become especially acute. Initially, the peculiarities of consciousness as a philosophical problem won't be centre stage. Instead, we'll think about mind in general. We'll try to come at the problem without too much differentiation at the start. Okay. I'm going to organise some of this with a distinction between two models. We can think of these as two models for minimal minds. Model one, a view with an emphasis on information processing in networks. Now, the what is information side of these questions will not be prominent in these lectures. I'm thinking more about the inner workings than about semantic properties. And for these purposes, information processing I see as a good gesture towards a family of views, a family of mechanisms featuring sparse collections of interactions, computational relationships in a very broad sense of that term. Now, the model talk is supposed to emphasize some looseness in what counts. A very simple Model 1 mechanism is a reflex arc, mediating an organism's response to some stimulus. And one hypothesis is that when you look at the history of nervous system activity and the mind, what you would see, if you could see all the stages, would be basically a history of this. So George Parker's history of nervous systems, hypothesized from the early 20th century, was like that. He thought the crucial move was the addition of a sensory device to a previously unconditional action pattern. So the action wasn't always produced, and that gives you, roughly speaking, a reflex. This kind of structure can, of course, be elaborated. Jumping ahead a century almost, the Transitions in Cognitive Evolution project of Andrew Barron, Marta Helena, and Colin Klein follows this path. They posit a series of transitions in neural network architecture that build on each other. In their transitions, they suppose you start with just any kind of network that does something useful, information processing for an organism. Centralization is what you would expect, some kind of collecting of control in a particular center. Recurrence is loops in the network. Lamination is the invention of layers, as in the human brain. And reflection, they think of as a situation where a computational architecture can form representations of its own control flow that can then be used to affect that control flow itself. It's social in the diagram, but it need not be. So that's a story about the evolution of the mind from what I think of as a sort of very much a Model 1 basis. Going back in time, now in evolutionary time, Model 1 networks are present in gene regulation. Gene regulatory networks are networks of interactions between genes and their products, which control which genes are active on which occasions and in which circumstances. And they subserve overtly cognitive whole organism activities in some organisms. For example, in bacteria, there are situations where a sugar can be sensed in the environment and particular enzymes are produced in response to that sugar. I'll actually go through this example in a moment. So there's a kind of quasi-cognitive flexibility in bacteria made possible by Model 1 networks that are genetic rather than neural. Okay, what is left to be Model 2? I said that Model 1 is information processing and very broadly computational. That doesn't mean it has to be classical in the sense used in cognitive science. In my sense, parallel distributed processing networks, PDP networks, count as Model 1. You might avoid traditional concepts of representation and computation, but there are still nodes and connections and an informational role in a broad sense. So what might be Model 2? Well, let's go back to the history of nervous systems. In nervous systems now, in our nervous systems, there are what we can call large-scale dynamic patterns. For example, the kind of thing picked up by an EEG device, oscillations, rhythmic oscillations on a large scale. This is a new review paper which emphasizes the contributions of a neuroscientist, Mac Pisano, from the 1960s. Pisano is someone who's influenced my thinking a lot here. And the point of the review is that these sorts of large-scale dynamic patterns, these oscillatory patterns in nervous systems, are all over the place and seem very old. They're perhaps roughly as old as nervous systems themselves. Now, their cognitive role is controversial. They have figured in ambitious views of how unity is achieved in perception, views of consciousness itself, and I'll talk about them tomorrow. They also figure in views of attention in animals far from us, in fruit flies, for example, as studied by Bruno van Swinderen. Other people see the oscillatory patterns in nervous systems as probably epiphenomenal, doing nothing, basically, or as having a supportive but not very cognitively specific role, perhaps like a clock. Now, we'll come back to the question of the role, but first, what might be distinctive here in relation to Model 1? In what sense might there be an alternative here? And what are the precursors of this, if there are any? What is the history? A wide range of organisms, some without nervous systems, use large-scale dynamic patterns in this sense, especially oscillations, as a tool. Now, I'll look more closely at this tomorrow, but I want the contrast to be clearish now. First, at the level of whole organism behavior, oscillations are used a lot by very small organisms. This is a paper by Kirsty Wan, showing that many small organisms use oscillations basically as a way of making perception work at all and a way of making action work at all. Perceiving in situations of noise and acting when you're faced with viscosity and no real inertia in your actions. That's a little different from bringing oscillatory patterns inside as a control device to help you do something that's not itself an oscillation. An example of this kind of thing is seen in slime molds. Now, that term, slime mold, covers a range of different blob-like organisms, fairly diverse, many of which move without nervous systems. One of them, Physarum, is essentially a single huge cell. It doesn't have borders of the normal kind. It has lots of nuclei, but it's sort of bounded by a single membrane, basically. Now, these organisms can move. They move by directing fluids within their bodies in projections that can extend in any direction. There are oscillations in the fluids controlled by muscle-like structures that contract. And control, sensing, and adaptive response can be achieved by increasing the tube diameters in areas that contact food. That means that more of the internal fluid ends up being pushed there by the oscillations, and other areas contract. Now, the presence of the oscillations is uncontroversial. The fact that they have this role in control is sometimes described as fairly well established and sometimes described as a bit more provisional. It's a good example. Oscillations play related roles in fungi and plants, not controlling movement though, because movement's not usually what they're up to, but oscillations control growth in plants and fungi and have a kind of communicative role also in fungi. There is conjectured to be a sensing role of oscillations in fungi that is akin to what seems to be present in the slime mold. We have oscillations within the sort of basically invisible threads that comprise most of what fungal life is. And when there's contact with the outside, that affects the oscillatory patterns, and that becomes a basis for sensing in the fungus. So the Model 2 idea in a pure form is the idea of spontaneous, large-scale dynamic patterns modulated as wholes by sensed events and other inputs. Ken Cheng at Macquarie University argues that traditional views and models of simple cognition based on feedback and error correction work much better when these ideas are combined with a recognition of oscillators as a platform on which things are done. And he describes how, in his own history as a scientist, he did experiments looking for error-correcting feedback, and because some of what happened he just regarded as noise, he didn't for a long time see the underlying role being played by oscillators in various empirical systems, and eventually did see it. Now, Cheng and others here are mostly talking about organisms that have nervous systems. And a theme of these lectures is that nervous systems combine the two families of processes, the Model 1 and Model 2 processes. In pure forms, where nervous systems are not involved, the Model 2 cases tend to be oddities, like the slime molds. Oddities because this is an organism trying to move without a nervous system. Okay, let's accept that these large-scale dynamic processes, especially oscillations, matter sometimes. How are they related to Model 1 phenomena? Well, in the neural case, in brains, people sometimes say, well, this is just zoomed out Model 1 activity, essentially. It's a level of description difference. My first reply is, well, perhaps sometimes, but these activities are also seen in non-neural organisms, organisms that don't have nervous systems. This phenomenon has its own history. A person might say, well, yeah, but there's another network, not a neural network, but another network underneath in those cases. And my reply is, well, in those cases, there is a lower level basis, but it's not very networkish in at least some cases. A system is not a network in the Model 1 sense if everything is connected to everything and has slight effects on everything. That's a kind of deviant sense of a network. Sparseness and selectivity is part of the Model 1 point, and Model 2 phenomena can have a little of that. Now, in the neural cases, talking about our brains, there are empirical uncertainties that are relevant here, I think. It's somewhat unclear what the relationship is between action potentials or spikes or the firing of neurons and some of the large-scale dynamic patterns that people have thought are important. You might wonder whether neural oscillations, what I'm calling Model 2 stuff, is just lots of Model 1 action potentials seen zoomed out. Now, as I understand it, that's not the case, or certainly not entirely. And the patterns you see in brain waves in an EEG mostly reflect weaker, non-spiking movements of ions across membranes in the brain. In the book Metazoa, I referred to this as a kind of electrical breathing, which is different from the more famous fits and sneezes, the action potentials of neurons themselves. Now, there are large-scale dynamic patterns in the spikes or the neural firings themselves. There is synchronized firing, and part of the point of the lower level oscillations in brain seems to be to coordinate or help coordinate those firings, but they are partly distinct. Okay, these levels and mixes problems will return, and indeed it's essential that they return, especially in the case of nervous systems, because I'm suggesting that nervous systems appear to be special in the way they bring two kinds of processes together, the networked point-to-point stuff and the large-scale dynamic patterns. But Model 2 processes have, as I said, they have their own history, intertwined with Model 1 history, but not reducible to it. Not all Model 2 processes have a Model 1 basis, and clearly there can be networks of the Model 1 kind that don't have a kind of Model 2 side to them. I'm using the word model here. You could also call them two families of processes. I'm going with Model 1, Model 2 talk, partly because I just don't have a simpler language that I like, but also to allow that there may be some role here for habits of thought and ways of looking at things that are suggested by the different processes themselves, but go further. For example, Model 2 people tend to emphasize spontaneity, an active rather than passive conception of the organism. Now, I resist this a little bit if it's taken to be, to tie you to a particular model of how things work. You might insist on spontaneity and activity within Model 1 and not see this as a real divide. But there might be some of this going on persistently and perhaps not irrationally. If you start from a sort of Model 2 way of looking at organisms, you may have a different view of which activities count as basic when we're thinking about cognition. You might resist the kind of definition that Shuttleworth gave that I had up on a slide earlier. Certainly, these models make the origins of the mental look different. They point differently to precursors and partial cases. For example, integration in Model 2 is kind of automatic. It's just there. And differentiation takes effort. In Model 1, differentiation is just there, and integration takes some work. A collapse into panpsychism will look different across the two roads. And another difference is one I will discuss in a moment. Just a momentary digression, a moment on the artificial. A conventional physical computer is not a sort of paradigm Model 1 object, I guess. Is it just that it lends itself to representing Model 1 processes, or it is physically a Model 1 object put together in unusually ways? I guess I think the latter, but I'm not quite sure what to think about that. Okay, so expressed in a kind of competitive way, we might say Model 1, cognition is built from the concatenation and elaboration of information processing networks. Model 2, cognition is created through the modulation of large-scale endogenous patterns of activity in whole systems. A natural response, if someone was to say that, is to say, well, can I please have a Model 3 or a Model 1.5? We have two resources. They point in somewhat different directions. They're both picking up on real features. And as I'm saying occasionally, we can see the nervous system as an invention that brings the two together. And this is, I think, part of its role in explaining the mental. But first, I want to spend a bit of time thinking about each of the resources in their own terms, the histories of each, the philosophical questions surrounding them, and so on. Model 1 today, Model 2 tomorrow. Okay, Model 1 processes involve network interactions that lend themselves to informational, sometimes or often computational description. And the features that matter here are not very self-bound or self-dependent. Boundaries don't matter very much. I said earlier that Model 1 activities are present in gene regulation networks. That's taking place within a cell, usually, but also often they are seen in cell-to-cell signaling within one organism. Gene regulation can involve that, and across organisms. The first gene regulation network uncovered in the 1950s and 1960s in E. coli, the bacterium, by the French scientists Monod and Jacob, is a simple one, but not that simple. Schematically, these bacteria prefer glucose as food, but they can use lactose if they need to. They have an enzyme for this, a lactose processing enzyme that's not usually produced. But if lactose is present and glucose is not present, they start making the enzyme. Now, the gene that makes the enzyme for lactose processing is usually kept off by a molecule X, we could say, that blocks the DNA from being used to make that enzyme. If lactose is around, though, a form of that chemical, lactose, interacts with the blocker in the cell to prevent the blocking. And also, if glucose, the preferred food, is not around, another molecule detects this and modifies another molecule, Z, that also binds to the DNA and encourages production of the lactose enzyme. So this is an AND operation with two conditions sensed, the presence of lactose and the absence of glucose, that turns on significant production of the lactose enzyme. It's approximately a Boolean AND operation, lactose and not glucose, and an AND with a not in there. Only approximately, because if lactose and glucose are both present, you get a little bit of the lactose enzyme produced, but not as much as if there was no glucose present. In this kind of gene regulation context, the biologist Yuri Allon talks about what he calls network motifs. The idea is there's a set of recurring regulation patterns by which biological processes are controlled. Just modifying his or borrowing his terminology, we might talk of cognitive motifs. These are all over the place in nervous systems, in genetic systems, and elsewhere, serving different pieces of the collection of roles seen on the Shuttleworth list. In nervous systems, these motifs are combined into large networks, but they also exist as fragments, integrated into other parts of bodies and other places. So roughly they will include simple input-output systems, Boolean systems like in the E. coli bacteria, doing ands and nots and the like, negative feedback systems, there are several kinds that Allon distinguishes, also write-read systems, simple kinds of memory. Now, as I said, it can be unclear when looking for these things whether signaling is taking place within or between organisms. In our understanding of Model 1 processes, there's often no pressure to tighten things up and make the unit more clear. There's only an optional link to any kind of self, to a unit housing the network or fragment, the cognitive motif. All you need, after all, is a relatively stable channel between nodes in the network, some way for influence to propagate, and a way to make enduring marks if it's a write-read system, and so on. In social insects like honeybees and ants, colonies are sometimes seen as superorganisms or just organisms. So is B to B signaling within or between individuals? Doesn't matter. You don't need to ask the question. Interactions between bacterial biofilms are also an example. Biofilms are clumps and sheets of bacterial cells present on our teeth, in places like pipes in hospitals, problematically, that are very tenacious and have a kind of semi-cooperative set of relationships within them. The bacteria can signal to each other in various ways, with chemical messages and also electrical signaling. And the signaling coordinates metabolic activity in the clump. Now, is a biofilm an organism or a collective? More the latter, though you can have doubts. Some people say it's along the way to organism status. Doesn't matter. We can still talk about signaling without asking a question like that. Now, parenthetically, I wasn't sure whether to use this example or not. I was reading about it in more detail last night. Is this really a Model 1 phenomenon, or is it a Model 1.5 phenomenon? It's a kind of mass signaling. It's not very targeted, and you might take that targeting to be essential to a Model 1 story. However, it's not a situation where you have the establishment spontaneously of a pattern with modulation of the pattern. It's closer to Model 1 than Model 2, at least. Some similar things happen in plants, similar in both respects. In this plant, a weed used in botany a lot, there is long-distance signaling of local damage to leaves. If a leaf is chewed, a signal is sent to other parts of the plant. The assault is made public to other parts of the plant, which prepare defenses. Now, is a plant an organism or a collective? Well, more the former, though you can have doubts, and people sometimes like to emphasize a disunity in plant organization. Again, though, for Model 1 purposes, it doesn't matter much. You don't have to ask. In a Model 1 setting, there is also no problem, no tension in recognizing nested units. Bees communicate, whatever you regard a bee as. Within a bee, its neurons form Model 1 networks, no problem. Within those cells, the neurons are gene regulatory networks, also no problem. All of this is straightforward to recognize. There's no tensions between them, no need to choose, where the real network is, at what level. All of this is not so clear, we will see, with the more self-hungry Model 2 phenomena. Now, this looseness that's characteristic of that's available in Model 1 processes is probably how a lot of things went before nervous systems were invented in the animal line and elsewhere. Looser collectives, a build-up of information processing capacity, cognitive motifs being introduced into different settings. Information processing can be built up in this way without worrying too much about the within and between distinction. There's no tension in their being like that. Now, metabolic life, as I emphasized back at the beginning, demands self-like units. There have to be boundaries for metabolism to be possible. But that's at the cell level. Once the thermodynamic problem has been solved at the cell level, with boundaries of some kind, there's no need to solve it again at the higher level in relation to multi-celled collectives. A kind of loose collectivity and vague collaboration can do fine at that level without any pressure to firm things up. Okay, that's my Model 1 tour. And there's one more topic which I'll have to say a bit about, but I suspect I have too much to cover all of it today. So Lydia, if you don't mind me asking, because I can't see the clock in the bright light there.
You could go for another 10.
Another 10, yes, I was
12.
hoping. Yeah, I'll go for another 10 and we'll see how we go. Okay, Model 1 networks have a local character that doesn't require the presence of clear units at the level of the containing system or the motif using system. Okay, but what do they require? There seems to be a threat of triviality here. Mere dispositions, especially when non-obvious in their selectivity, can be seen as a kind of information processing if you impose that language. This is a historical path to a version of panpsychism. Similarly, any time an effect is dependent on two causes, we might see a Boolean AND operation, and so on. So in the case of Model 1 processes, especially in the simple cases, there's a kind of threat of trivialization of the description. One family of ways to make the idea non-trivial, to firm things up, and perhaps to connect to semantic properties, information in richer senses, is to link this story about Model 1 processes to the idea of a consequence etiology. I'm resurrecting here a philosophical term of art from the 1970s. This is basically a requirement of some kind of stabilization or selection operating on the system. The idea is, it has to be that the Model 1 network is the way it is because of some effect it has or is likely to have. The role it has in mediating interactions in the network is responsible in some way for it being there. Selection shapes responsiveness, mark production, mark interpretation, and the rest. Now, I'm discussing this in the context of the Model 1 tour. All of this is relevant to the Model 2 side as well, but questions of triviality, how do you distinguish this from a trivial case, don't seem to arise so pressingly in a Model 2 context. I'm not sure if there's a deep difference there or not, and I'll try to come back to this perhaps tomorrow. Anyway, in the 1970s and onwards, in the literature on trying to make scientific naturalistic sense of teleological concepts, Larry Wright introduced the idea of a consequence etiology. An etiology or origin for something that involves its effects. In the case of a biological function, I have Wright's definition on the slide. The function of x is z if and only if x is there because it does z. That's the reason it's there. And the consequence etiology idea can also be applied to goals, where, as I see it, functions in this family of concepts apply paradigmatically to objects and structures, and goals to activities or behaviors. And just as in the case with functions, an activity has a goal if the activity comes to exist because it will tend, with many qualifications, to lead to some outcome G. Now, especially in the function case, where Wright says x is there because it does z, Wright seems to like the way the formula flirts with paradox. Something at the token level can't come to exist because of what it will do once it exists. That's not possible. But the impossible case can be approximated in roughly two ways: by foresight and by what we can call recurrence with selection. Now, foresight's less important here. The idea is x exists because we think it will lead to y, and that's why we brought it into existence. The other processes involving recurrence are what matter. This is a family of processes in which past instances of x, whatever it is, in some sort of lineage have had a particular effect, z, and this has led to more cases of x being produced. This requirement it's roughly what Ruth Millikan referred to as a reproductive established family for people familiar with her work. And in evolutionary history, or the history of the world, there has been a series of inventions in which this sort of situation, the approximation to the impossible consequence etiology, has come to exist in new ways. The first, historically, was evolution by natural selection. In a population, some version of a trait X comes to exist by chance, and it is kept around, refined, reproduced, induced to recur because of a particular effect it has, Z. Reinforcement learning. An agent produces X, a behavior, fortuitously, and it has good effects, Z, and the agent can track this and is more likely to produce that behavior in the future. Imitation of successful behaviors. I might note somebody else doing X and achieving a good effect, and this induces me to do the same thing. And then eventually we get in the history of life to foresight, where I have a mental model of a situation and can produce X right off the bat in a new situation because I think it will lead to Z. And the more refined cases of learning in this first recurrence category merge into foresight, as seen in the psychology of model-based learning. Okay. Now I do face a bit of a choice, because if I move ahead, it will take more time. Can you give me a time update, Linnea? It's about 5 or 7 minutes. Yeah, actually what I'll do, is it something like that? Yeah. Yeah, I hate it when people go over, so I'm not going to go over. If I get to 55, make a gesture. I'll pull out one other point from this one, and I'll think tonight about whether this is all I need to sort of resume where I was going to resume tomorrow. Back in those 1970s discussions, some critics saw that Wright's criteria are too loose to capture the intuitive idea of a function or a goal. They let cases of the wrong kind in. Here's an example that I modeled on cases that they introduced in that literature. Suppose you have a small rock in a fast-flowing stream that's supporting a larger rock. And if it wasn't holding up the big rock, it would be washed away. would no longer be there. Wright seems to be saying that the function of a small rock is to support the larger rock. That's the thing it does that explains why it's there. Wright went back and forth a little in his response to cases like this. And it led to a literature which I now think is a somewhat unfortunate literature, because the point of the discussion was taken to be, how do we sharpen up or tighten up criteria like the one that Wright had offered so we can capture the biological phenomenon of function and goal? I think we sort of missed an opportunity there. A better response to these cases would have been to say, that's interesting. The Wright formula picks out something about the real cases where something has a function in the biological sense. But there are also these halfway, liminal, not quite basement type cases. And we should just think about all the cases together. We should take this as an invitation to think about the processes, not how they relate to a conceptual analysis. I think I'll just briefly mention a case that I find interesting here, which involves the climate. I'll introduce it and then go through it and then stop. In case like small rock holding up big rock in the stream, you say, well, the thing it does that explains why it's there is hold up the bigger rock. There's not even the faintest hint of mentality or purpose or anything here. The only thing that's being explained is persistence at the token level, this rock now, in terms of its effects. And the story of the difference between cases like this and cases that really involve biological functions and goals and things like that, it's largely a matter of a transition from mere persistence to recurrence. And recurrence of the organized kind that figures in consequence etiologies roughly requires life or intentional action of an artifact, but life in the natural cases. So you have the rock cases and you have the real cases where the heart has a function of pumping blood and the mating display has the function of attracting mates. There are some cases in between that are interesting to think about. And in the spirit of the exploration of liminal cases, I'll say a bit about a particular case in between. These are cases that have a classical negative feedback character to them, where no one designed it, no one put it in place. They're sort of, in a sense, spontaneously arising negative feedback processes. An example is what's sometimes called the slow carbon cycle, one of the processes by which carbon cycles through the Earth. This is the carbonate-silicate cycle, not the cycle that goes through photosynthesis and respiration much more quickly. In this cycle, carbon molecules move through the atmosphere to the oceans, then to rocks formed beneath the sea, then back into the atmosphere through volcanoes. So there's an atmospheric stage and there are non-atmospheric, oceanic and rock-bound stages for carbon. And the process just naturally has negative feedback. When it's warm, part of the cycle runs harder and locks more carbon in rocks. Because that carbon is not in the atmosphere, that has a cooling effect on the Earth. When it's cool, the cycle puts more carbon into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, which has a warming effect. And this is apparently part of what has stabilized temperatures on the Earth on a much longer timescale than the one we're grappling now with fossil fuels, plants, and climate change and the like. Now, in a case like this, there is in one sense the opposite of a consequence etiology in Wright's sense, but really a kind of transformed relative of it with a related role. So in a standard consequence etiology, in Wright's sense, the present structure or state, the thing you're looking at, not departures from it, does something which is good or self-perpetuating. There's a thing it does that explains why it's there. In negative feedback, it's not that, it's that the departure, if it happens, does something that brings the system back towards an equilibrium. A departure cancels itself. A departure has effects that explain why in the future it's not there. These negative feedback processes can be set up by accident, purely by accident. in the special sense of accident that involves whole planet phenomena and the laws of physics and chemistry. They need not involve life or design. They can just happen. And this kind of thing is part of what has moved people like Tim Lanton to defend and refine the Gaia conception of the Earth, in which the Earth as a whole has something like an organismal nature, featuring self-regulation. And I look at a cycle like this and I think, well, it's true that feedback of this kind is lifelike in one way, but it can arise outside of a context that is organismal or lifelike in any other way. It can just happen. It has, however, unlike the case of pure persistence, the small rock holding up the big rock, which prevents it from being washed away, it has, unlike the pure persistence case, just a hint, I think, of real goal-directedness. And this surrounds even the more recent discussions of Gaia-like interpretations of atmospheric cycles. Things are then very different when you have not just feedback of this kind, but reproduction, not just persistence and not just returning to a state when you depart from it, but when you have the multiplication of cases forming a lineage. Then, if there is heredity, if variations are passed on, a Darwinian process can get underway and a full consequence etiology situation in Wright's sense can be in place. Members of a lineage can come to exist because of what past members have done. I think that's pretty much specific to life and to the metabolic control of energy which is required for sophisticated kinds of reproduction. As I said, it's one long lecture broken into two, and that'll be the break.